minimum viable product, right? You get something working, you get it out there, and let the customers give you the feedback, bugs if any, so you can go to the next iteration and so on and so on. In that process, I think security at times takes a backseat. And in light of the GPL3 section 6, what I heard, I mean, I didn't delve into this in more detail earlier, and only today, thank you for enlightening me, but that's a scary issue. So what does it do to this very vibrant culture we have in the Silicon Valley? We do so much innovation, we do so much product development, we do it faster than any place else on this earth. Does IoT pose new challenges? What do we need to be cognizant about?
Should I go first? Okay. Well, I will, to follow up, the GPL Section 6 anti-TiVoization clause is one that, frankly, I wouldn't say it exactly keeps me up at night, but it is one that, working with clients, I'm very, very strong with them about be careful of using GPL3 code. Now, the problem with it is, as you're saying, in Silicon Valley and in the high-tech industry, people are moving very fast. And one of the things that comes up all the times with my clients is that they're so desperate to get something put together that they just throw all this software in, and using free and open source software is great because you're not reinventing the wheel, so it speeds you up. And it's only once they're about to go to market and a customer says, wait a second, what open source software do you have in here? Or they're looking to have an investment, and the venture firm says, we want an audit of what's in your code. So that slowly, they're speeding up in the kind of the front part of things, but it's slowing them down in the end not to pay attention to these issues up front. So I'm not sure if I'm totally answering your question, but with respect to GPL Section 6, I think that part of the reason I find it so alarming, if you will, or at least maybe I shouldn't say alarming, but something of which to be very aware, is that, as I mentioned earlier, technology is changing very fast. And as I mentioned, routers that 10 years ago were only used in industry now are in my kid's home, my kid's room. There's just all sorts of stuff that years ago we never thought would be a user product or in the home that now is. Counterpoint to this is that people who are very involved in the open source community are quite passionate about licensing. And for example, one of the very popular pieces of software is called Samba. And I have a couple of clients that are wanting to use it right now. It is licensed only under GPL3. And I actually called the kind of main head of the project the other day and I said, please, could we negotiate a commercial license? And he said, no, we will not let you. This is software that's integral to networking devices. So I guess the answer is I think it's a tough question. You need to be aware of it.
Feel free to jump in if you have any.
Well, I will defer to you on anything GPL related. What I can tell you on the patent side is that one of the arts to drafting patent applications is to try to predict the future, while at the same time trying to keep the scope of coverage broad enough so that you are covering things or technology that is basically the future innovation that might go on top of your invention would still be covered by your claims. So, I like talking to engineers because you actually understand this, but patent claims, you can think of them like Venn diagrams. So as long as you get inside the circle with your patent claims, you've got an infringement case. So thinking in terms of, what someone might do to improve your device, you might find yourself in what we call a blocking situation. So if someone improves your device and they get a claim on the improvement, it could be that you have a situation where you can't use their improvement, but they can't sell their improved device because you're blocking them.
But that can happen a lot in the Internet of Things. I mean, that's the point all of you alluded to. With this interoperability and inter-device communication, it can happen. It can happen so much where you could easily be in a situation like the one you described. And in fact, that was one of my related questions. That this diversified infringement. I mean, that creates a real problem for if you even want to go prosecute a patent, right? I mean, if you haven't been very careful in how you drafted stuff, and now you have diversified infringement, I mean, how do you even fight that battle?
Well, I think you're talking about divided infringement.
Sorry,
So
divide.
divided infringement, a good patent attorney can prevent that from happening, frankly. It's one of those things that there's a lot of people who got patents before they understood that this was a real problem. And, you know, like every field, there are good patent lawyers and not so good patent lawyers. And so it's just something that you need to be aware of, that if you write claims that have sort of a distributed infringement population, that your claims are pretty much not going to be worth anything.
You can use actually other claims, dependent claims, to the first claim that takes care of the distribution.
Well, actually, that's not right. So if you have an independent claim that has a divided infringement problem, in most cases, the way most dependent claims are written, that's not going to save the problem, because in order to infringe a dependent claim, you have to infringe the independent claim. So you would need a completely different claim altogether. And it's doable, you just need to be thinking about it as you move forward. And you need to think about who your potential targets are going to be, right? Because you talk about a distributed environment, right? So you have the customer, and then you have the person who's your competitor, right? You really want to sue your competitor, not your customer. So you have to draft your claims that way as well. So there's a lot of thinking that goes into this.
I can add on to Jeff's point that one trick that patent lawyers use to deal with divided infringement is a lot of times there's one device made by one company transmitting and another device by another company receiving. And the trick that the patent drafters try to use is to focus on the sending device or the receiving device, but let's not focus on the whole system at the same time, or you're going to wrap up two companies in a net and run into divided infringement issues. But if you can take one device, one company, often that's a way around divided infringement as a claiming strategy. But I agree with Jeff that from an engineering perspective, it's something to think about, but it should be something your patent lawyer is very well versed in.
Yeah, so think of it this way. So let's say this is the person that you want to, that would be your target for an infringement claim, and this is the person that you don't want to have to sue. So you can, instead of saying that this guy sends something to this guy, you can say that this guy receives something from this guy, and that gets rid of the divided infringement problem. But you got to think of that up front, because you can't save that later on.
But you must make sure that you keep the usefulness of the idea.
Absolutely.
If you are losing the usefulness by focusing on one side, you lost everything.
That is true, and that's something to be
And I understand the receiving part as part of it.
Mhm.
It's like all the patterns actually on compression, as an example, where you are focusing on the decompression, and then automatically in the compression, you leave some room for additional ideas.
Or you can file two patents, because it's hard to know who
Yeah.
the right target is. You can file a compression patent and a decompression patent, and actually the specifications of the patents can be the same, right? You can just have two different sets of claims.
Did you hear how Jeff just doubled his business?
I was going to say that the ability to file for a patent early on is a tough one for a lot of startups, and they don't have the money.
That's
So-
true. There's a process the Patent Office has called provisional patents that most of you have probably heard of, which is a less expensive way of at least putting your stake in the ground. In my experience, they can sometimes give you a false sense of security, but it's better than nothing. Well, actually, I'd say it's better than nothing. Sometimes it's better than nothing, sometimes it's worse than anything, because you think you've done it and you really haven't.
But when you are filing the provisional, the specification has to be detailed enough.
Exactly. So in other words,
So,
so let's say you file a provisional on day one, and you disclose all kinds of stuff. And let's say you disclose a combination of elements A, B, and C. And then, you keep doing your development. It turns out that the secret sauce is D. But you're busy, and you're trying to get funded, and you got HR issues, and you got a vacation to Lake Tahoe, and all this other stuff going on. And the year anniversary comes along, and you say, holy smokes, I gotta convert, your patent attorney's been, harassing you for months to get your provisional on file. So you finally, you convert it a year later, because you have to do it within a year, And your claims, instead of saying I claim A, B, and C, you claim A, B, C, and D. But guess what? That provisional got you nothing, because it had to disclose A, B, C, and D. And remember, in a first-to-file world, if someone came into the patent office in that 1-year interval, they're going to get the patent, not you.
Maybe it's worthwhile also to mention the PCT filing. That
I think we have a question in the back.
Well, the PCT would have to be filed within a year of the provisional as well, so yeah.
Yeah, I had a question on free software licensing, and just at a kind of a general high level, and I guess sort of kind of to back up. I mean, the GNU folks have been around for 30 years. Linux has been around for 20 years. If there isn't a whole lot of case law out there, what that implies to me is that there hasn't been a whole lot of litigation out there. Maybe I'm wrong. And if there hasn't been a whole lot of litigation out there, why are people worried, really? I mean, there are real things to worry about, and there are not real things to worry about in terms of litigation. And I just want a little more clarity on
Okay.
why do I need to worry about Richard Stallman? And
So I would, actually, at this point, I wouldn't worry so much about Richard Stallman. So there are several things going on. One is that, you're correct, there's not been a lot of litigation. There has been a lot of informal enforcement. And you'll hear my biases coming out. The Free Software Foundation, Evan Moglen, who was general counsel for FSF, up until about 2003, the way things were enforced was that Evan or Richard would call up a company and go, hey, we hear you're using GPL code and you're not redistributing. And we're about to create a public relations disaster for you if you don't make that code available. Nobody knows what actually happened on those phone calls or meetings, but we know that there were hundreds of calls like that. So there's been an informal enforcement. There's also the fact that the open source community, which is something I didn't mention, it's almost a religious movement, at least particularly the people who were originally involved in it. And people really, really care that you comply with their licenses. And if they find out that you're not complying, they will post on things like Slashdot, other websites that are developer chat rooms. And a classic example of this is Cisco and Linksys. Cisco, I'm forgetting what year it was, but they spent about $500 million to buy Linksys. And a few months after Linksys was acquired, I guess, disgruntled software developer who'd worked at Linksys posted on Slashdot, which is a common website for open source developers, said, guess what? Linksys is built on Linux. So Cisco just spent $500 million for code that it must make publicly available. That was a disaster. I mean, that's like the worst nightmare. Since then, just to follow up, since 2003, there's been a new organization called the Software Freedom Law Center, which is essentially the enforcement arm of the Free Software Foundation. And they have filed lawsuits. There have been about 14 lawsuits so far that I'm aware of in the United States. And all of those have ended in confidential settlements where all we know is required disclosure of source code, required creation of an open source program, and required payment of attorney's fees. And just one last thing, though, is, and this I think is probably the most important, is that maybe in part because of increased litigation, but certainly because of increased usage, investors, customers, acquirers, in case of an IPO, there is a whole lot more scrutiny on use of open source. And if you are using it and you aren't using it in compliance, and you then want to sell your product or sell your company, I can virtually guarantee you that you're not going to have that happen without a source code scan and a compliance scan.
I can back that. I've worked on diligences for big companies where the deals completely collapsed because they were open source issues.
Yeah, so it's not just fear of litigation, it's fear of other consequences of non-compliance.
Jeff, could you please comment on the impact that you think the new IEEE patent policy with respect to the standards is going to have?
I'm actually glad that I actually read some about that this week. I think it's important. Not to cast aspersions on any company, but I was involved in some of the early WAN bus wars, and so I met some of the JEDEC folks from that time frame, and they were pissed off. And I think that it's important for, people who are working on standards to feel as though that they're not walking themselves into a patent infringement lawsuit. And so I applaud the IEEE for giving some clarity to people who work on their standards. I wish that all the organizations would do it, and I understand that there's a lot of politics involved, but the IEEE's standard, I don't remember all the detail. Literally, I skimmed it yesterday, just happened to notice it had come out. I don't remember all the things, but it seems to be a pretty rock solid patent policy. I don't know who knows about these things, but when groups of companies get together to form standards, there's always this issue is that, okay, we're going to build something into a standard, but what happens if there are patents out there that cover the standard? And I mean, you can imagine in this day with patent trolls or MPEs that if they get their hands on patents that read on standards, that's their dream patent, right? And especially since a lot of companies that participate in standards organizations, they're seeking ways to monetize their patent portfolios, and so they might belong to a standards organization, and then a few years after the standard is promulgated, they'll say, I can sell my whole patent portfolio for.
More likely they go belly up.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of startups that just disappear.
Well, that's true, but I think that what really gets people's ire up are when big companies seeking to monetize their patents, they go to a patent aggregator and they say, I got a portfolio of 50, Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or SD-WAN patents or whatever it is. They're probably worth a lot of money. Have at it. And the one thing that the IEEE standard, I think it was in the IEEE, the new patent policy, is that you have to, if you're going to do that, you have to make the sale contingent on honoring the patent policy. So that should go a long way to solving some of the
That part is actually not new. That's been in there.
So I don't know, so is there anything in specific that you have?
Well, one of the interesting elements is that the license has to be attached to the smallest component, because there have been instances in the past, you implemented this on one port of your humongous box. I want 10% of the whole box.
So this is a big issue in patent litigation right now. We've all heard of, people getting tagged for $600 million judgments and whatnot from, juries. And a lot of people complain, and, a lot of the focus in any patent litigation, and I do a lot of it, so I know, is there infringement, and is the patent valid? And the damages part, you hand it off to an economist with a PhD from MIT or Stanford, and they would, a lot of people would do that. They would hand it off, and they would come back with a damages theory. And like any litigation, there's lots of arguments every side can make, and patent attorneys would do this too when they drafted claims. Instead of claiming a TV tuner, they would claim a TV. Instead of claiming, an SD-RAM, they would, a memory chip, they would claim the memory chip in combination with the microprocessor, so they would try to read the whole patent. And so that's just, I think what the idea is getting that from is that this has been heavily litigated over the past several years. And the good news, if you're not suing somebody, the good news is if you're being sued, is that the courts have really done a good job, I think, of telling the patent community that if you're going to get a reasonable royalty for your invention, it's going to be based on what the sale, what drove the demand. In other words, if you invented a memory technology, we're going to base the royalty on what that contributed to the memory chip, not what it contributed to the television set of a PC.
Next question.
And to add to that, the Federal Circuit in the past year also came out with a new case, Cisco or Apple Vernetics, where they started to apply a smallest saleable unit, so they won't put a royalty on the big device. Maybe they'll look at the smaller element that drives demand. It's a very new case law out of the Federal Circuit.
The Federal Circuit is effectively the Supreme Court. It's the Kafka in your language. They've been hit pretty hard by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court took some interest in patent law about 5-6 years ago.
That's what they get for being in the same city.
Yeah, well, you laugh, I don't, anecdotes are familiar with. I was actually I was part of this global fellows program for the Federal Circuit a couple of year ago, when so 12 American patent attorneys and 12 German patent attorneys, and we did a week in BC and a week in Munich. And we met Justice Alito, who is on the Supreme Court, and Justice Alito basically comes into a room filled with patent attorneys and says, we know patent law better than you do, and we're going to do what we want to do. So.
Okay, a question there.
First, I'd like to thank you for coming and sharing such meaty information with us tonight. I specialize in preparing due diligence for generally smaller companies going through acquisition, and nearly every single one of them uses open source. I don't know a lot about it, which is why I'm here. None of them have any documentation whatsoever, and most of them are very hesitant to spend any funds that they have on anything on basic corporate legal. Besides scaring the pants off of them with some tips I'm hoping to get from you, what would you recommend that I can tell them so that should they end up in your office finally, what would help you help them?
So first of all, I should give you my card. No, but I think saying, that's kind of what I said in response to the gentleman earlier, that this is real. I understand that it costs money, but actually compliance, if you start out early, it shouldn't cost a lot of money. One thing I like to do a lot is come in and do training sessions, and often I'll go and do a 1 or 2 hour brown box bag, covering some of what I talked about tonight, but talking with development teams and helping them understand how to comply and what steps need to be taken. And to be honest, doing that, I think, is probably the best thing any company can do towards compliance, because once developers understand, they're going to be a lot more careful about what they do. I mean, no one, maybe there are some people, but I don't know of any developer that's brought in open source out of ill will. It's because they want to do the right thing. They want to build a great product. So I'd suggest, a short training session. I can direct you to some materials on the web if you want, and I'd be more than happy to come and talk also. So
I'd love that. Thank you.
There's also, for what it's worth, scanning tools post hoc. So if you have source code and you don't know if there's open source in it, you can purchase scanning tools at varying prices to scan it. I don't know how effective those are. You might be able to.
That's a whole other topic. There are quite a number of them. There are actually a couple that are publicly available. Each one of them is good at what it's good at, but you kind of need to run 2 or 3 to really make sure you're completely covered. The problem with doing it post hoc is that, particularly I have a couple of clients who've been writing code for years and years. They've got millions of lines of code. To run a black duck scan can be like $250,000, $300,000 deal. So it can get very pricey, and then sometimes the reports that are popped out contain all sorts of red flags, and you spend a ton of consulting time going through checking, is this real, is this a red flag, should I be concerned? So that's why I try to encourage companies, get your process in place from the get-go. Because then, later when you do a black duck scan, you know what's in your code. And you can more readily figure out what's a red flag and what's not.
There's a reason why a lot of people like us who went to law school also might have become doctors, because there's a lot of similarities between the professions, which is, what you were saying is, if you get us in early, we actually cost you a lot less money. And instead of going to the doctor to get a physical, you can capture something before it's a real problem. We understand everyone's busy and they don't want to spend money on anything, but, there's that old air filter commercial from the 70s. They used to play your football games, and you can pay me now, you can pay me a lot more later.
Same with plumbers.
I have a question related to AIE. You mentioned that it's the first to file in the things, and the quickest way would be to file a provisional patent, and you mentioned that you have A, B, C, and not D. I suppose you have only A, B, and C, then that should serve the purpose for provisional patent, provided you finish your utility within a year.
That's right. And
the second part of the question I have for Alicia is, you mentioned the two tests, 1 and 2. Do you have to satisfy both or only one? Or between two, which one you have to do first? And the last one is related to, there is a comment going on from UPTO office, which is due in March of this year. Would like to elaborate a little bit more on those related to these issues.
Yeah, I think the third one, maybe we can talk, we can take it offline. We're coming short on time. Let's just do the 1 and 2 questions.
So, in order to have a valid patent, it has to be novel, it has to be not obvious, and you have to disclose what you thought it was your invention, and you have to enable somebody else to make and use it. So if you're provisional, which you're really most concerned about are the last two, which is, did you adequately describe your invention? Lawyers call that written description. And did you enable someone to go out and make and use your invention? And the invention is defined by the claim that will eventually issue. So if you provisional adequately discloses the combination of A, B, and C, and you end up claiming in your actual patent that you converted, or you filed a year later, the utility application also claims A, B, and C, then the provisional is great. And the nice thing about provisionals is that they don't have to be a work of art. We file provisionals that are PowerPoint presentations that, that erase the patent office. But the problem, and I think I said this before with provisionals, is that it can lull you into a false sense of security because you file a provisional and you think, well, I'm done. I got my provisional file, I can go off and do other stuff now. And the provisional is only as good as what the provisional says. And if it doesn't say enough, then it bought you nothing.
On the Supreme Court test for abstract ideas, the two elements are independent. You can win under either of them. So if you don't win under the first element, you can still win under the second element. What we're finding is we haven't even had a year of case law under the Alice regime, but I think last time I looked at the statistics, which was late last week, 60% of patents looked at by district courts were being overturned under Alice and found invalid. So even though it was higher, but it's going down. Yeah. So even though you get two chances, a lot of people are, 60% are failing those two chances.
Okay, in the back.
Hi. I just had a comment. Some of these things that you were saying remind me of. I was part of a company that had an IoT platform, and when you're doing due diligence, people are definitely going to look at open source software and how you dealt with that. It's really easy to tell your team from the beginning, every time they bring stuff in, register it with your corporate counsel. But we had customers that routinely wanted to see that stuff. So not just acquisitions, the companies we sold to, because they're large medical companies, things like that, they would want to see the same analysis just to buy our product.
That's increasingly happening.
Yeah, so I'm just saying that the issue of it isn't litigation so much, is you can't even sell it to a mature company sometimes. Thanks.
Stephanie had a question.
Oh yeah, so there's something, there's something about the logic of this that I don't quite understand. So about the open source, right? It kind of seems like a virus. Like if one part of your code is open source, then suddenly the whole thing becomes open source, like with the copyleft stuff that you were talking about. But I would think that when you write a patent, there's like a hierarchy of claims, and the lowest level of the claim would be the actual open software, right? But like the way you combine different programs and different codes for your idea, is that not patentable itself? Like maybe you use Linux to write some of your code, but if you had sort of a notable idea, it's not as, I mean, you might have used a pencil to make your invention, but just, you know what I mean? Like it shouldn't infect the whole, I guess what I'm saying is,
Infect the patentability of it, you mean?
Well, I guess what I mean is, it seems like if something becomes open source, then yes, you have to make your code available. But isn't there like a higher level where anybody who actually uses that code could be infringing on a higher level claim?
Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure I understand your question, but let me see if I can at least get some fundamental stuff out there, maybe that can point us in the direction. So first of all, so copyright and patents are fundamentally different things. So, I mean, she has forgotten more copyright law than I'll ever know. I just don't, you know, it's a different discipline. And so whether or not something's covered by a GNU license or some kind of open source license, unless it's one of these new ones that enforces a patent license into the mix, and whether something's patentable are really two completely different inquiries. So, you know, a patent, in order to get a patent, remember I just said a few minutes ago, it has to be new and it has to be non-obvious.
Right.
And if something is existing in a public, you know, open source software, it's very likely that if your invention is tied too closely to whatever that open source software is, you can't get a patent on it because it's not new.
I guess what I'm wondering is the monetary incentive for companies to protect themselves, right? So like if I come up with a cool piece of software, right, and I have to make it open source, why is that a problem for me monetarily? Because if I had a good idea, then presumably I can patent that software, even if I have to make it available to people. So if they then use that, great, actually it's good, because they'll go use it for their products, but they're infringing on my patent.
So this is, you're touching on something that actually is becoming kind of a hot issue in the open source world, which is, are you, particularly because some of the licenses do not have explicit patent licenses. For example, BSD or MIT, the permissive licenses don't have explicit patent licenses. There's quite a bit of discussion right now in the open source community of, well, if I'm granting you a license to use modified copyright, copy and distribute my code, am I not implicitly granting you a patent license as well? And nobody knows the answer to that yet. So I think that's...
Well, you would have to have a patent to give a license to, first of all.
You'd have to have a patent to give a license to.
Well, and it would
Yeah.
have to be patentable in the software domain,
Correct.
Yes.
which is yet another problem.
Yeah.
Because I kind of think like if I were you, like I would encourage my clients who may have these issues, rather than spend a lot of money on tools to figure out whether they've infringed or all this process, just write a really good patent around it.
Patents are super expensive.
Patents are super expensive. Patents are super expensive, and
if it's not patentable, then anybody else can copy it anyway. Like if it's just some
That's
really
true.
quick startup where they just do some simple IoT device where they just patch together simple software, well, it's like someone's going to copy it anyway. Or it's like, look at Dropbox and Box and all those things. They all do the same thing. It's because, it's not that unique.
But the
That's
existence,
not quite fair. If it's copyrightable and it's not patentable, you still have protection under the Copyright Act, which is what Jeff was explaining. So you have two separate protections. You may not be able to get patent protection. You can get copyright protection, but it's very narrow to your specific code.
Yeah, I think in some countries that's probably the only way to monetize your product, because they don't allow software patents, as Jeff was commenting.
Oh, I see.
also, having the product in hand is a very small part of a business and of marketing a product. It's not.
Okay, one last question, and we have to wrap up.
So I'd like to ask a question about litigation bubbles. We've seen over the last few years a lot of litigation in the area of cell phones, different companies suing one another over cellular technologies, the NPEs coming in and doing a lot of litigation as well. I went to a really interesting presentation a few weeks ago about these the factors that cause these bubbles. And they were saying, although that smartphone litigation is perhaps dropping off now, the next two topics that it said bubbles were going to occur in was wearables and the Internet of Things. Yeah, the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things was an area where they were predicting we were going to start to see a lot of litigation in the near future. I wanted to get the panel's opinion on that. Are you seeing litigation in that area? Are you sensing it starting? And do you think it's going to be a bubble like the smartphone was?
So I think the smartphone wars, and I'm not involved in them, so so I'm not as close to it as some others might be. That's sort of a once in a generation kind of battle that, at least in my experience, doesn't happen very often. Because you had two really entrenched, highly capitalized, companies with lots of money who were fighting over something that they saw as being the absolute future. I mean, everyone in this room either has an iPhone or an Android phone, maybe, you know, one Windows phone. The Internet of Things, I think, is going to be a lot more, devices. And so it's, I think, you know, who knows, it's not going to be that we're fighting over, you know, the smartphone business, which is it's such an enormous market that, you know, a couple of percentage points of market share, if you can get an injunction, is worth spending $15–20 million on a patent infringement case. You know, if it's going to be, I brought up Fitbit before. I don't have one, and maybe there are no competitors. I don't know, but you know, some kind of wearable device. I think there'll be a lot more of them, and it's not going to be sort of a duopoly like what we see in smartphones. So I haven't, you know, I do litigation for the most part, and I haven't seen any. And I watch the dockets, so I see what's happening. I haven't seen much in the way of Internet of Things litigation. I forgot the other area you had mentioned.
Well, the other area was wearables,
Yeah.
but I'm more interested in the Internet of Things.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen much yet. I mean, so you have to understand about patent litigation, which is that no one files a patent infringement lawsuit unless there's a fair amount of money at stake. And the market's just, I think a lot of people are getting patents and trying to put their stake in the ground, but the market's not there yet to make it worthwhile to spend a lot of money on lawyers to try to enforce things. We'll probably get there. Whether it will be as big as smartphones, I really don't. You know, I've been doing this for more than 20 years now, and in the 20 years I've been doing this, that's the only time I've seen a, absolute battle royale between two enormous competitors in one space.
It's all about money.
Yeah.
Okay, with that, we have to wrap up. Please join me in thanking the panel. We have a token of appreciation with certificates. This is also your official record of having given this introduction. Thank you. And we have about 5 minutes to network with you.